Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about factoring trinomials and the perfect square trinomial. So what are perfect squares? Well, a perfect square is simply a rational number times itself, which is a way of talking about squaring. So if I looked at 1 and I said 1 squared, that equals 1. And 2 squared equals 4. And 3 squared equals 9, and so forth. Those are perfect squares. And what we have a formula for perfect squares. These are my trinomials, and this is the factored form of the trinomial, this is a plus b squared, which is simply a plus b times a plus b. And this is a minus b squared, which is simply a minus b times a minus b. So let's look at this in reverse to be able to see the perfect square trinomial. And what we've already covered is multiplying polynomials. So what we're going to start with is this form here to get to our trinomial. So here's an example. X plus 4 squared. Well, I know that a is going to equal x and b is going to equal 4. A and b. A and b. So color coded them, and then I just rewrote my squared as the product of two binomials, and then I distribute or FOIL, and this is what I end up with: x squared plus 8x plus 16. Well, this is a square and 16 is a square. They're both perfect squares. The main thing is to look at the middle term. The middle term here, it says 2 times a times b. I can rewrite 2 times a is x, times b, and b is 4. 2 times a times b, or x times 4, is the same as 8x. And I can rewrite 16 as 4 squared, such that it looks like a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. So sometimes what you have to do, you've heard of reverse engineering, where you take something that's manufactured and then you take it apart to be able to understand. This is kind of how we're doing the basis of this problem. Let's look at another one. This time I have a coefficient with my variable. So I have 2x minus 3, and that's squared. So identify a is 2x, and b, we'll call it a negative 3. So whenever I look at this, again, I've color coded them, the a and the b. I just use the square as products. So here are my two factors. And whenever I multiply them together, I end up with 4x squared minus 12x plus 9. Well, 4x squared can be written as 2x squared. 2 squared is 4, x squared is x squared, x squared is x squared. Plus, I have a negative 2ab. So plus 2 times a was 2x, b was a negative 3. Well, that value right there is the same as a negative 12. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times a negative 3 is a negative 12. So I've just rewritten that middle term as its factors. And then plus a negative 3 squared. A negative 3 squared is the same as 9, giving me this form: a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. So let's look at this as an example with the steps that we need to perform. So for perfect square trinomials, here's our example. We're to factor this trinomial. Well, the first thing to do is identify a and b. A is, and I went ahead and have written 1x. So a equals 1x. And b equals 5, because 5 squared is 25. More or less, I took the square root of both of these. So a equals 1x and b equals 5. Next, determine if the trinomial is a perfect square. How we do that is that we look at that second term, 10x. Does 10x equal 2 times a times b? When I say 2 times a is 1x, so 2 times x times b is 5, so 2 times x times 5 is 10x. Yes, it's a perfect square trinomial. So here's my trinomial, 2x plus 10x plus 25. My a is x, my b is 5, so it's simply x plus 5 squared. And then check your work. X plus 5 times x plus 5 is x squared plus 10x plus 25. One thing, I'm sorry, I didn't cover this. In order to determine the form, is it a plus b squared or a minus b squared? You look at the sign with the second term. This was a plus sign, so therefore it is a plus b squared. And those are your steps for your perfect square trinomials. So let's look at some examples. And what we'll do is I'll put them up here, and then you can pause the video and let's see if we end up with the same answers. Okay, for the first one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify a and b. Well, a here is simply x and b is 9. So I'm going to look at my second term, 18x, and does that equal 2 times a times b? So 2 times x times 9, it does equals 18x. So this is a perfect square trinomial. I look at this sign right here. It's a plus sign. So what I have is a plus b squared. Therefore, I turn around and say, what is a? A is x plus what is b? 9 squared. Check my work. X plus 9 times x plus 9. X squared plus 9x plus 9x is 18x plus 81. That's what I started with. I have factored it. Alright, second one. Identify my a. A is going to be, well, first off, here, let's do this. We have a's in our equation, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply rewrite them as a different letter because I use a and b in my formula, so I'll just call it t. And now that helps me not to be confused. So a equals 4t and b equals 3. Because 4 squared is 16, t squared is t squared, 3 squared is 9. So I've identified those. Now I need to look up here and see. I need a negative 24t. Does that equal 2 times a times b? Well, 2 times a, 4t, times b, which is 3. Let's see, that's 2 times 4 is 8, times 3 is 24. Whoops. I'll put a negative 3 there. That way we can see it. Equals a negative 24t. Yes. I can have my perfect square. I look at my sign. It's negative. So I have a minus b squared. Therefore, that is 4t minus 3 squared. Again, check your work. 4t minus 3. 4t minus 3. It gives me 16t squared, and that is minus 12t plus minus 12t, so minus 24t plus 9. And then I can rewrite it in the original letter that they gave me. And the whole reason I did that is because I use a and b in my formula, and that can mess you up. what I started with. That is correct. Whoops, box that one. Okay, last one. Last one, a little tricky. Hopefully you got it. First thing I will do is I will factor out a 3. Now this is what I'm going to look at right here. A equals y, b equals 1. I need to look at this. Can it equal a negative 2y to make sure that it is a perfect square trinomial. 2 times a, and I'll call b a negative 1, times a negative 1. Yes, negative 2y. That's what I needed. So it is a perfect square trinomial here inside of the parentheses. So now I simply say, look at my sign, it's negative, so I have a minus b squared. Therefore, a is y and b is a negative 1 squared. 3 times y minus 1. That 3 is from up there. I got to make sure I include that. If I were to check my answer, I'll multiply the parentheses first. All of these are just multiplications. It's the same as saying 2 times 2 times 3. Okay, I can say 2 times 3 and then times 2. It doesn't matter the order that I multiply them in. But I'm going to go ahead and do these. It'll just be easier. So I have 3 times y squared minus 2y plus 1. 3y squared minus 6y plus 3. That is what I started with. Ladies and gentlemen, that is perfect square trinomials. So please critically think about what you're doing. And this is just a shortcut method. You could factor these just like you factored before. But once you start seeing them and you know the formula, you can visualize those. A lot of these steps, once you start seeing this, you'll automatically see, oh, well, that's x plus 9 squared. So critically think, structure your homework, and good luck on your remaining homework problems.